Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Adam Bass, and we're here with Logan, Jesse Hahn, and Jack. And today we have another guest knocking on our door, and that is the candidate known as Dave Cavell, 4th Congressional District candidate from Massachusetts. Dave, welcome to the Kai Cabin.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's good to see you again. We got a chance to talk a couple of weeks ago, and it's a pleasure to meet you, Jesse and Logan and Jack. And I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled that you're giving such a profile to this race, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to chat with all of you on a Saturday evening.
Well, there's no other better place to be than the Kai Cabin. So I'm gonna turn it over to Logan for our first question. Logan, take it away.
Yeah, well, it's great having you on, Dave. My first question is, how well do you think Charlie Baker has done in handling coronavirus, and do you think we are reopening too quickly?
You know, this is I'm really glad you asked it. This is something that I think all of us are thinking about. You know, I have to say, I have some real concerns with the approach that Governor Baker has taken to reopening the state of Massachusetts, and mostly some of the people who don't seem to have been included in those conversations. And who I'm talking about there are frontline workers, nurses. Who I'm talking about there are workers, and who I'm talking about there are others who are on the front lines of responding to this pandemic. You know, when we started to reopen the state, we heard from a lot of labor organizations that they hadn't really been consulted in that process, which is odd because they would have been the first people that I would have called. They're on the front lines of the crisis. Nurses are telling me that they still don't have the protective equipment, the masks, the gowns that they need to stay safe and be able to treat patients. That we still don't have emergency paid sick leave for workers. We don't have really flexible childcare options for workers. You know, I think in a whole number of ways, that's actually not been what I think we needed in this country. That's actually not what I would have hoped for as part of a response here. And look, I'm glad that our numbers are declining. I'm glad that you know, that by some metrics, the state of Massachusetts is doing better than it was feared that we would do. But I don't think that means we take our foot off the gas. I think that if anything, what that means is that we double down on what's working, and you know, we really ramp up the efforts to do widespread testing, to do mass contact tracing, so that we can with and make sure that that we're getting a lockdown on those. And the last thing I'll just say to you here is, I actually this week went and got a COVID test myself. Not because I have any symptoms, but because I wanted to see what the process was like. I was at protests over the last few weeks, and you know, the director of the CDC recommended that all Americans who went to protests get tested. So I figured, okay, let's see what that looks like. And the first urgent care clinic that I called wanted me to pay $160 out of pocket for a coronavirus test. And I think that is ridiculous. Frankly, we are 3 months into this crisis. If the CDC is recommending that all Americans go get tested, and even an American like me with health insurance is expected to pay $160 out of pocket, that's not something that many families in this state, in this district, in this country can afford. So I ended up being able to get a free test through my insurance provider. But you know, I still haven't gotten the results of it. And at this point, this was, I think, 5 days ago. So I have some concerns. You know, the last thing that we need is to go right back down into a shutdown. The last thing that we need is a second wave of this virus to hit us, given how much tragedy we have already seen in communities like Brockton and Chelsea and others that were vulnerable for so many reasons to this crisis beforehand. So I just think the answer is incomplete, but I'm not impressed with some of the shortcomings that I've seen so far.
To go off of not putting the foot pedal on the brake here, it seems to me, from what media outlets are reporting, what states are reporting, people seem to be not caring about the virus anymore. We've obviously had a shift in the narrative due to what happened with George Floyd, completely understandable. But it seems that we are in a transitional time where people are not really starting to care about what's going on with the virus and are being impatient. So how do we become more aware about this is not over yet, or what we need to do in order to keep awareness within the story of the coronavirus?
Well, Adam, it's a really good question. And I want to start by saying, I think that the people that I've talked to, frankly, for the most part, they have still been, very well aware of this virus and very well aware of the consequences. I think I will also say that, of course, all of us want to get back to some semblance of normalcy. I know that for many of you, this has interrupted your education and your lives in really significant ways. And that's true for high school and college students and elementary school students across the country. And as a former fourth grade public school teacher myself, that I know how big a deal that is. So I get it. And businesses are really suffering. I get that there's real urgency, and that people really want to reopen. And then the other part of your question, I think, really was the sort of horrifying video of the murder of George Floyd. Just the latest evidence of a Black person in this country being murdered because of systemic racism. When we say his name, we also recognize Breonna Taylor's name. I believe this is today the 3-month anniversary of her shooting death at the hands of the police. We recognize Ahmaud Arbery, we recognize Tamir Rice, we recognize Eric Garner, we recognize so many more names, some of which we know and some of which we don't know because they weren't captured on camera. Frankly, for the last 400 years in this country, people who have suffered marginalization and brutalization because of systemic racism. And so, I understand why people felt like at a time like that, they were willing to take a risk. To go out and raise their voices and protest and say that we have to change things that must change. I think one of the powerful things I heard a leader in the Black Lives Matter movement say is, a lot of people have talked about, this being the new normal that we're living in now and going back to the old normal, and how we can never do that. We can never go back to the normal that existed in this country before this pandemic, because we saw the consequences. It's not a coincidence that communities with large communities of color, immigrant communities, working class communities were hardest hit by COVID. The consequences of systemic racism are felt everywhere. I think what I would say is that people are still trying to find that balance, and this is the true consequence of having a president who dismissed this crisis when it first happened, when it was first occurring, said that it was going to disappear like magic, told people to inject themselves with bleach as a strategy for curing themselves of this virus, and at every stage has sort of failed us, has failed the country and has failed the world in terms of believing in science and facts and truth and knowledge, and giving us good information. I mean, and this isn't in some ways rocket science. I worked with the pandemic response team that we've heard so much about in the White House when I was there with President Obama. The Zika virus was the big concern when I was helping prepare some remarks. And the pandemic response team was so clear about the steps that needed to be taken and the ways to do public health right. This virus, of course, would have been bad no matter who was president, but the failures to take it seriously early on, the failures to ramp up testing and protective equipment, left us so vulnerable in this country and sent such mixed messages that are still ongoing. We're seeing rates go up in Florida and in Texas and in other states that have reopened too quickly and haven't followed the guidance. So I think the answer to your question, Adam, is that everybody is trying to strike that balance. We still have to be concerned about public health, and we still have to find ways to raise our voices and identify the systemic inequalities that we have to address, because there are multiple viruses that have infected this country. COVID is just the latest, and we have to address them all together.
Going off of the federal response you were talking about, do you think that we need a second stimulus package? And if so, how would you differentiate that from what has already been passed? What would you want to include in this second package?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth just taking a step back and remembering, for a long time, I mean, I've been in politics at this point for 15 years, and even longer, frankly, because my mom was dragging me to political meetings and protests when I was young. But she helped found a group called Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts, and has always been my middle name is Franklin because I'm named after Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So she was very clear with me about where things stood, and I'm really grateful for that.
The
But I
apple
think
doesn't fall far from the tree, huh?
what? Yeah, no,
Yeah.
yes, that was not. She used to tell me that I could grow up to be a Republican, and that was totally fine. I just couldn't sleep in her house or eat her food. So she made things pretty clear for me. But look, I think so often in politics, it's just worth noting that for years we were told, well, we can't afford to combat the climate crisis. We can't afford to provide to do anything about student debt. We can't afford to do anything about affordable childcare and early education, universal pre-K in this country. And then as soon as the coronavirus pandemic hits, trillions of dollars all of a sudden become available, and Republican members of Congress are more than happy to provide them. So I think that's just worth noting in terms of, the money's there. We just need the willpower. We need to get people organized. But yeah, to your point about this specific aid package, look, I think that there's some good things that Congress did. It's great that a $1,200 payment was delivered to all Americans, well, to a lot of Americans. It's great that there was some increased funding for testing and some increased funding for protective equipment and some assistance for businesses that have payroll issues. But Jack, I think to your point, we all know that that was not nearly enough. We all know that $1,200, frankly, for a lot of families and for a lot of people in this country, that's like half a month's rent. And for all of you, think about paying for your education, delaying your student loan debt by a few months. That's not going to cut it. That's just not going to be acceptable in an environment where millions of Americans find themselves without work and without health care all of a sudden overnight. And so I think we need to dramatically expand the ambition here. We need to get much more emergency aid and hazard pay to frontline workers, nurses, grocery stores, others. We need to make sure that student loan debt is canceled. I'm talking tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt being canceled for a generation that was being bankrupted by it before this pandemic. I think it's really about reimagining how we use this aid. I think some of it, of course, has to go to these short-term needs, but I think some of it needs to go toward things that we've always known we needed to address. We've always known we needed to invest in these things, and what better chance to do it than right now? I mean, there are millions of people in this country who need affordable childcare. What better time to do it than during this pandemic? We still need to ramp up tests. We still need to ramp up protective equipment. And frankly, we still need to protect our elections and our democracy. I mean, it's no surprise that President Trump has been saying he doesn't want people to vote by mail. If I had failed the country as significantly as he had over the past few months and his first term, I wouldn't want to face the voters either. But we know that this is their strategy. The strategy is not even to win these arguments because he knows he can't, but to make sure that we don't vote in them at all, to make sure that African-American communities, the vote is suppressed, to make sure that for young people, you can't vote with your student ID, to make sure that, we don't lower the voting age to 16. We don't make DC a state, despite the fact that there are 700,000 Americans, predominantly African-Americans living there who deserve a vote in Congress. So, I think in all of these ways, this is something else that we need to fund, is voting by mail, is ending partisan gerrymandering, and is investing in election protections so that poll workers can still stay safe and that all Americans know that they don't have to choose between their safety and participating in democracy as they were forced to do in Wisconsin in their state elections.
I know you talked about healthcare, a lot of people losing their healthcare a little bit. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you were in the White House when the Affordable Care Act was passed, but I was wondering what your thoughts are about if we should expand on the Affordable Care Act with a public option, or if we should move towards what Senator Warren and Senator Sanders are proposing in Medicare for All.
Yes. So I got to the White House, sort of in the second term. I started there in 2015. So the Affordable Care Act had been passed into law before I got there, but we were still making the argument to protect it from the constant attacks and sabotage from Republicans in Congress, and still expanding it to 26 million Americans. And I'm really proud of the work that was done there. Look, here's the goal. It's to recognize that healthcare is a human right, that every single American deserves healthcare, that they can afford, that it's quality. And I think the goal, simply stated, is healthcare for all. Now, I was the first candidate in this race to endorse a presidential candidate, and I endorsed Elizabeth Warren, in part because she had a plan that I thought would get health care to every single American in a way that they could afford. And just look at, I mean, exactly as you just said, Jesse, think about what we're seeing in this country. I mean, yes, the coronavirus was terrible across the world. It was terrible for countries in Europe as well. Lots of people in Europe lost their jobs, but they didn't lose their health care. And this is the problem with an employer-based healthcare system, is that there's just too much at stake. When if you lose your job, you lose your healthcare, particularly as we're seeing in the midst of a crisis, which is the last time that we need to be costing people their healthcare. So I was in favor of a system that gets administrative costs out and executive pay out and gets more affordable healthcare to Americans. Now, I was also at the center of the biggest expansions in healthcare in modern history. So when I was with Deval Patrick, we were the first state in the country to have universal healthcare. And when I was in the White House, we were expanding healthcare to 26 million Americans. So I think the answer is there are a few paths to get to this goal. And I certainly believe in the Medicare for All system. I also believe that, you know, if we can't get there immediately, there are other good paths that would expand healthcare to more Americans, and I'd be interested in working on those. The last thing that I will just say here is, we've been having this argument in the Democratic Party, and it's an important one. And there are lots of people that are going to come on the Cod Cabin and talk about this, that are going to talk about this when they're running for office, and that's great. But what I saw was that it really matters how we talk about these issues. And I think this is why John Favreau from Pod Save America has endorsed me, and Ben Rhodes and a whole bunch of others, is because we have to talk about these issues a lot better than we've been doing. And I saw this in the White House. When we said to Americans, what do you think about Obamacare? You know that only 40% of Americans thought that that was a good idea. And then when we said, what do you think about the Affordable Care Act? Oh, now, all of a sudden, they said, well, we don't like Obamacare, but the Affordable Care Act, that has like 65% approval. And then when you would say, well, put that aside, even though this is the exact same thing, put that aside. What do you think about children being able to stay on their parents' health insurance till they turn 26? What do you think about the fact that if you have a pre-existing condition, you should still be able to buy insurance? 85%. 85% approval. And I think that there's a lesson there, not just on healthcare, but with respect to, you know, the 91% of Americans who think that if you want to buy a gun, you should have to pass a background check, the 75% of Americans who think that climate change is real. I think the lesson here is the majority of Americans are actually not as divided as the president would want us to believe, and as a number of other people would lead you to believe. The truth is, if we talk about these issues the right way, if we talk about progressive values and making real change in people's lives the right way, the majority of the country is on board. We just have to do that.
Absolutely. My second question is going to be about charter schools.
Okay.
Alan Casey and Jake Auchinclaw have both expressed support for charter schools, and I want to know, what is your opinion on them?
Yeah, you know, this is an area where there are real differences in this race. And I'm glad you brought this up, because I'm the only former public school teacher in the race, and I think it shows. You mentioned two candidates who support it. Jessie Mermel, when she was the head of the Alliance for Business Leadership, they came out in strong, unreserved support for Question 2 in Massachusetts, which would lift the charter school cap. And this is a real debate that I hope that we can have as part of this race. I have never supported lifting the charter school cap. I have never thought that charter schools were necessarily the right answer to education. And frankly, when I was a teacher, the rhetoric from the Bush administration was that, first of all, teachers were to blame for what was the challenges in American education. It wasn't about the lack of funding. It wasn't about funding disparities in low-income communities. It was just about how teachers were to blame. And the answer was charter schools and vouchers. And I knew that that was wrong when I was a teacher in one of the poorest school districts in America in the South Bronx. The problem was that on my first day, I had 32 students, 2 of whom had to sit on the carpet because I didn't have enough chairs in my classroom. The night before my first day teaching, I had to go spend $200 of my own money at Home Depot buying whiteboards for my classroom and gluing them to the walls. I remember I was there till midnight that night because that's what my students deserved. And there was no money for it. And that's why you've seen teachers in states like Oklahoma and Wisconsin and elsewhere take to the street and demand that the state actually invest in students and in schools again. That's why, no, I think that, you know, we have an excellent system of education here in Massachusetts. I'm thrilled that the legislature acted to revise the funding formula through the Student Opportunities Act to reduce the disparities between low-income communities and very wealthy communities that have more property tax money to invest in their school system. But we're going to be rolling out in the campaign an education plan. A plan that's modeled after the fact that Horace Mann was born right here in the 4th Congressional District, and the first public school in the country was right here in the 4th Congressional District in Franklin, Massachusetts. And that's a legacy that I think is important and one that we need to build on. And so this plan would actually have a blueprint for how we get to a system of education in this country that actually offers opportunity to every student. And is actually world-class for every student. And that means universal early education and pre-K that goes all the way up through free public higher education for students who are pursuing that route. And it means that K-12 education needs a whole bunch more funding. It needs more funding for teacher professional development. We need to recruit a more diverse and inclusive group of teachers, fund school counselors better than we're doing, a whole range of things. But I think that this is a critical issue, and it's frankly one of the reasons that as a former public school teacher, I wanted to run for Congress in this era when, particularly during COVID, school budgets are under threat. Our public school system's under threat. Even wealthy communities are thinking about teacher layoffs. We cannot afford to do that. This is the single most important investment we make as a country, is in our young people, is in our future. So I'm glad you brought it up.
We have about 8 minutes left, so these questions are going to be a little quick. So, so one of the things that we've talked about in the last interview with you was name recognition. And as the Senate race goes on, in the primary, it seems to get worse and worse for all the candidates right now in the 4th Congressional District. Even high-name profiles such as Alan Casey and Jesse Vermel, they are still being heard with a resounding who? In Needham, even in Brookline and in Newton. Not many people are politically attuned. So I've already discussed how you break the ice, but how do you keep it up when the Senate race keeps getting more and more heated, especially online?
Yeah, it is. You're right. I mean, it's the most sort of unprecedented political environment in I would say in a century to run for office. I've often asked if anybody knows somebody who worked on the Woodrow Wilson campaign who could give any advice to us about how to run for office when you can't. My strategy in this race was to go everywhere and meet everyone, right? I worked for 3 candidates who were told that they were never going to win their election. I worked for Deval Patrick, who started out at, I think, 5% name recognition when he announced his candidacy and was running. I worked for Barack Obama and for Maura Healey. And every time I was told by the people in the know that they had no chance of winning. They were great people, but it just wasn't the right time for them. And so I learned early on that those are the people that you can safely ignore, are the people who tell you a year before the election, oh, I know exactly how this is going to turn out, right? We are really bad at predicting who wins elections in this country. And so I think that's something I've learned that doesn't matter all that much. But you're absolutely right that we've had to be innovative and we've had to figure out how do you reach out to people when you can't go everywhere and meet everyone, but you have to do that virtually. I think it's a few things, and I'll be quick about it. The first is ours, I believe, is the only website that is not just in English, but that human beings have also translated into Spanish and Portuguese. And particularly when you're running in a district that's predominantly made up of the South Coast, and Fall River, you have to have a website that actually lets everybody know why you're running and who you are and what you want to do. I think we have some really exciting digital organizing tools that we're going to be rolling out. I'll leave that. Isn't that what's called like a teaser? You all are in the
yeah, it is a teaser.
Yeah, so I'll defer to you on that. But yes, we have some really exciting stuff that we're going to be rolling out. And then, we've been finding ways of engaging with everyone. We've been having town halls with experts and doctors and leaders of nonprofits and others across the district. We've been really excited to have thousands of people watch those. My wife and I cook dinner every Friday night, every Shabbat for us. When this pandemic started, we didn't really know what people would want to watch, but we still wanted to reach out for people. So we said, well, look, we're cooking dinner on Friday night. We can't go out. We can't go to an event. So let's just flip on the camera and see if anybody wants to tell us what small businesses they're supporting or what they're cooking, and talk about food insecurity right now during this pandemic, and ask questions. And so, we've been getting thousands of views on those as well. And the message really is we are still here for everyone, whether it's the 34 cities and towns, the resources that we found for every single one of them and put up on the COVID resources page on the website, davecavell.com, or whether it's in the ways that we're still doing outreach to every single person in this district. Just know we are not taking our foot off the gas. We are going to reach out to everyone. We are going to talk about the stakes in this election. I think we are in very good shape to win on September 1st and make real change for this district.
Yeah, I think digital outreach, the innovation that the candidates in this race have had to do so far is really interesting. I've seen a couple of your cooking videos. I know that Jesse Mermel and Alan Casey have TikToks now for the campaign, so that's been really interesting to see. I just want to pivot a little bit more to policy here. On your website, it says you support felon disenfranchisement. And I just wanted to ask if that applies to all felonies and if it applies to felons who are currently serving their sentence.
Re-enfranchisement.
Right. Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah,
no, not a problem.
Ending disenfranchisement.
Yes,
that's my bad.
I knew what you meant. I just wanted to make sure that that nobody was confused about this. The thing that I will say is that this is something that I've seen up close. When I worked in the Attorney General's office, I participated in restorative justice retreats at Norfolk MCI, which is a prison in the 4th Congressional District, because I felt like anybody who was involved in the law enforcement system in any way should spend time in a prison and should confront the consequences of mass incarceration. I think one of the most interesting things I learned was that everybody agreed that this system isn't working. And for those who are unfamiliar, some of you probably are familiar with this term. Restorative justice is about bringing everyone together. So that means the incarcerated men in this prison, as well as prosecutors, judges, survivors, families of victims, and have a conversation about what's going on in the criminal justice system and the shortcomings that we have to confront. And it was clear that the system isn't working. It was clear that things need to change. And when I was in law school, I actually worked with the Office of Returning Citizen Affairs in Washington, D.C. I was at Georgetown, and I saw the ways in which these people who were coming back from prison were getting no support, no actual job training, no actual assistance with housing or food insecurity. And that was setting them up for real challenges and recidivism that didn't need to be the case. And so I think we need to do a lot more to fix those issues in this country. And that means everything from criminal justice reform to education and substance use treatment in prisons and a whole host of things. And then yes, felon reenfranchisement. So this isn't exactly novel. The state of Florida actually passed a law here that does this. And it's, I think, actually something that is really critical. There's a bunch of different components to this. It has to be implemented, and I believe that it does. There are certain felonies that are excluded, certain extreme crimes like murder and violent sex crimes. But the truth is, to me, that we have disenfranchised millions of Americans. And again, looking at the statistics, unsurprisingly, that burden has predominantly fallen on communities of color, and we have disenfranchised millions of Black and Brown Americans as a result of this system of mass incarceration. So while we work on ending systemic racism, while we work on decriminalizing poverty, which is what we've criminalized to a large extent, I think we need to also get very serious about making sure that people in this country have the right to vote, which I think is fundamental.
All right, thanks for that answer. I'm gonna have the last question. We're coming up on your 30-minute limit. So
Okay.
I see on your issues page that unlike the other candidates, you list anti-Semitism as one of your priorities, fighting anti-Semitism. And I was wondering, you're not shy about your Jewish faith, how your faith influences your values and your politics.
Oh, well, that's thank you. Thank you for asking that. And, you know, as we come to the conclusion of Shabbat, it is that I'm glad that you brought that up. You know, on the website, I wanted to talk about that I care about combating anti-Semitism, and then also note that that I'm against hate and discrimination in all its forms. And frankly, one of the points I've been making is that, you know, people, when I go to temple, people are afraid. Well, you know, of course, before the pandemic forced us to change the in-person services, every time the back door in the room would open during a Shabbat service or a high holiday service, a lot of people would start to turn and check and see who just walked in, because they were afraid. They were afraid that somebody, because of the loose gun laws that we have in this country, fortunately not in Massachusetts, but in too many other states, would come in to do us harm. And that's not just happening in synagogues. People in mosques are afraid for the same reason. People in so many other faith communities are afraid for the same reason. You all grew up having to do active shooter lockdown drills for the same reason, which is a tragedy and unthinkable. So, you know, I think that that what my Jewish faith has sort of taught me, what growing up at my temple and having rabbis who describe themselves as my God squad taught me, was that you know, one of the big concepts in Judaism is tikkun olam, and the idea there is that it is about repairing the world, and that's something that we are all called to do. And so much of all religion that is practiced everywhere in the world is about treating others as you would want to be treated, is about looking out for those who are unable to look out for themselves, to care for and heal the sick. And I think that is really instructive for me, and should be really instructive for all of us. I mean, I think, again, back to the point, the majority of the country is not that divided. The majority of people agree that we are supposed to do good in this world and leave this world better to those who come after us than we found it. And whether you get that from faith or from any other moral code, I think that we need to act like that. And that's why I'm running. You know, we have kicked the can down the road on so many of these issues for so long, and we've run out of road. And we're at a real choice point. We're either going to do something about these issues or we're not. And, you know, as the person in the race who's had that experience at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, and is ready on day one for this moment, I think that is why I'm running, and that is why I'm thrilled that you gave me this opportunity to come back and chat with you all tonight.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you here.
Yeah, of course.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming on, Dave. We hope to have you again sometime. And yeah, thank you all for listening to the Cod Cabin. Take care and have a good night.